Imagine a nation that is just, well, basically born into economic freefall.
Right, a complete collapse of the old system.
Exactly. The year is 1991. You've got these massive factories built for a super rigid, state-run socialist system, and suddenly they're completely obsolete. They're just rusting quietly because the guaranteed markets at the Eastern Bloc just vanished overnight.
Yeah, and you have to remember the currency at that time. It was experiencing catastrophic hyperinflation.
Oh, it was wild. The paper it was printed on was nearly worthless. And the landscape is totally dominated by traditional, labor-intensive agriculture. The uncertainty of this newly independent state trying to find its footing in a hyper-competitive, globalized world is just palpable. You don't have to look hard to see a society standing right on a knife's edge.
It was an incredibly precarious moment.
But then you fast forward to 2023. You're looking at the exact same geographical coordinates, but the reality is just totally unrecognizable. Those sprawling agricultural fields, now they're crisscrossed by the invisible hum of fiber optic networks.
It's a profound transformation.
It really is. The old state-run factories have been eclipsed by bustling service sectors, digital tech hubs, modern neonatal clinics. Women are holding advanced university degrees at historic, completely unprecedented rates. And you've got wind turbines beginning to rotate in the exact same skyline that used to be just choked entirely by coal smoke.
And I think it's important to point out that this isn't some theoretical modeling exercise.
No, not at all.
This is the documented, highly complex metamorphosis of the Republic of North Macedonia over the last 3 decades.
It is a remarkable trajectory.
It really is. And what makes it so vital to analyze isn't just the sheer scale of the change, but the mechanics of how a country completely rewires its economic and social DNA.
Yeah, the nuts and bolts of it.
Exactly. Because when you transition from a post-socialist industrial and agricultural model to a modern service-driven digital society, you don't just change how people work, you change how long they live, how many children they have, what they learn, and literally what they breathe.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today we are taking a really comprehensive look at exactly how this happened. We are working off a fascinating 15-page academic synthesis report.
And it is dense.
Oh, incredibly dense. It takes this massive mountain of World Bank dataset indicators. I mean, we're talking thousands of rows of data covering everything from greenhouse gas emissions to infant mortality. And it distills them into a multidimensional blueprint of North Macedonia's development.
And I think that's the key here. It's multidimensional.
Right. And our mission for you today, the listener, is to extract the underlying narrative hidden in all these spreadsheets. We want to find those aha moments. How does a society fundamentally upgrade its wealth, health, and human capital?
That's the core question.
And perhaps most importantly, what can this specific case study teach you about the hidden macroeconomic forces that are quietly reshaping your own country right now? We are going to dig into the friction points, the paradoxes, the triumphs, and we're doing this without taking any political sides, just following the data.
That is exactly the right approach, because data at this scale, it's essentially the biography of a nation.
A biography written in numbers.
Precisely. Our goal is to impartially examine the World Bank's findings and just look past the surface level numbers. We need to understand the causality.
Right, the why.
Yeah, we aren't just going to tell you what the growth rate was. We are going to explore why the structure of the economy shifted, how that impacted the average citizen, and what structural vulnerabilities actually remain today.
So let's start right at the top, looking at the pure economic engine of the country, which the report lays out in its opening pages. When you look at the adjusted net national income, and the researchers use constant 2015 US dollars here to strip away the illusion of inflation, the early 1990s look like an absolute roller coaster.
Violently volatile.
Yeah, the data literally shows negative growth intervals. The economy is actively shrinking. But then the chaos starts to subside. It stabilizes. And as it stabilizes, it begins this relentless climb, eventually reaching a peak of roughly $9.2 billion by 2019.
Which is a massive leap from where they started.
Huge. But the thing that really catches the eye on this graph is the angle of the trajectory. Right around the year 2000, the upward curve just sharply steepens. The growth engine kicks into a completely different gear.
To understand that steepening curve, we really have to look at the structural reality of the early 1990s post-socialist transition.
Set the stage for us.
Well, In the early 90s, the volatility was driven by what economists call shock therapy. It's the sudden, often brutal transition from a planned economy to a market economy.
So ripping the Band-Aid off.
Exactly. State subsidies evaporated, outdated supply chains just collapsed, and hyperinflation wiped out people's savings. It is a period of intense destruction of old capital.
That sounds incredibly painful for the average person.
It was, but by the late 1990s and early 2000s, macroeconomic stabilization programs began to take hold, and that is when you see the fundamental shift in how the country actually generates wealth.
Right, the structural transformation.
Yeah, the data shows the value added by agriculture plummeting to historic lows. Industry, which includes things like manufacturing and construction, finds a floor and stabilizes at around 24% of the GDP.
Okay, so agriculture goes down, industry holds steady. What goes up?
The service sector, it absolutely explodes. By 2021, services become the absolute dominant force in the entire economy.
I see the shift in the data, but let's break down the mechanics for the listener. Why does moving from a farm to an office desk or, a retail storefront suddenly steepen the wealth curve of an entire nation?
It all comes down to a core economic concept called labor productivity.
Which means what, exactly?
It simply means the amount of economic value one human being can generate in a given hour of work. When your economy is heavily weighted toward traditional agriculture, you are bound by the physical limits of the universe.
Right. A farmer can only harvest so much wheat in a day.
Exactly. You are limited by the seasons, the weather, human muscle. But when you shift your economic center of gravity to services, telecommunications, finance, information technology, specialized retail, you remove that physical ceiling.
Oh, I see.
A software engineer or a financial analyst can write a piece of code or structure a deal that generates exponentially more value in a single afternoon than a farm worker can produce in a whole month.
Oh.
Yeah. This structural shift from low productivity agriculture to high productivity services is what creates that steep upward curve in national income.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense. It's like a teenager going through a massive growth spurt while simultaneously switching their college major from, traditional farming to IT.
That's a great way to look at it.
But I noticed something in the report's methodology that I want to push back on, or at least get some clarity on. Throughout this section, the World Bank data relies heavily on something called the Atlas method to calculate gross national income, or GNI.
Yes, the Atlas method.
Now, I know we promised not to bog the listener down in textbook definitions, but if we're talking about a country that experienced massive currency volatility in the 90s, how do we know this $9.2 billion peak is real wealth? How do we know it's not just some mathematical trick of exchange rates?
That is a vital distinction, and it's exactly why the World Bank uses the Atlas method instead of just a raw currency conversion.
Okay, so how does it work?
Imagine if you measured your personal wealth in a currency that suddenly dropped 20% in value overnight due to a political scandal or a global market panic.
That would be terrifying.
Right, and if we just looked at today's exchange rate, it would look like your standard of living totally collapsed, even if you still own the exact same house, the same car, and bought the same groceries.
Because the local purchasing power might not have changed that drastically.
Exactly. In emerging economies, exchange rates bounce around constantly based on speculation and short-term shocks. The Atlas method smooths out all this noise.
How does it do that?
It applies a conversion factor that averages the country's exchange rate for the current year and the 2 preceding years. And then it adjusts that average for differences in inflation rates between the country and international benchmarks, like the Eurozone or the US dollar.
Ah, okay, so it acts like a shock absorber for the data.
Precisely.
It prevents a temporary currency panic from looking like a permanent economic depression on the graph.
That's exactly it. By using a 3-year moving average adjusted for inflation, the Atlas method reveals the underlying reality. So when the report states that the GNI via the Atlas method rose steadily, eventually climbing over $8,000 per capita recently, we can be highly confident that this represents a real, tangible expansion in the purchasing power and living standards of the citizens.
Not just a statistical illusion created by a fluctuating currency.
Right, it's real wealth.
Okay, so the growth is mathematically real. The teenagers are out of the fields, they're working in server farms, and the economy is getting bigger. But this brings me to a massive point of friction.
Let's hear it.
I am always incredibly skeptical when I look at these macroeconomic charts that just point up and to the right. Does a higher GNI automatically mean the country is actually better off? Or is there a scenario where a nation is generating a massive amount of cash on paper, but they are secretly burning the furniture to keep the house warm?
I am so glad you brought that up because traditional GDP and GNI are fundamentally flawed metrics if you are trying to measure long-term prosperity.
Why is that?
They only measure the volume of economic activity. They do not measure the cost of that activity.
Okay, give me an example.
If a country decides to clear-cut an ancient, irreplaceable forest and sell all the timber, traditional GDP goes up. The economy looks fantastic on a spreadsheet that year. But obviously, the nation has just impoverished its future.
Right, because the forest is gone forever.
Exactly. To answer your question about whether they are burning the furniture, we have to look at page 4 of the academic report. This introduces a metric called adjusted net savings, or ANS.
And this is where the narrative takes a really sharp turn. Because when we look at the adjusted net savings data for North Macedonia, specifically in the early 2000s, around 2001 and 2002, this number was actually negative.
Yes, below zero.
But over the last decade, it has swung into the positive and stabilized at over 14% of the GNI. So what is ANS actually calculating that GDP ignores?
Adjusted net savings is the ultimate reality check for an economy. It is designed to measure the true, sustainable quality of a country's growth.
Okay, how do they calculate it?
The calculation starts with gross national savings. That's the actual money the country is putting in the bank. Then it adds investments in human capital, specifically education spending, because educating a child is essentially saving for the future productivity of the nation.
Makes sense. So
Okay.
far, so good.
But then comes the penalty phase. What's fascinating here is how traditional GDP completely ignores the environmental check a country writes against its own future. ANS deducts the depletion of natural resources. It subtracts the value of the timber, the minerals, and the fossil fuels that were extracted and can never be used again.
Wow. So it docks you for selling off the family silver.
Precisely. And it goes even further. It deducts the localized health and economic damage caused by pollution, specifically particulate matter emissions, known as PM 2.5.
That's the really fine soot, right?
Yeah, the fine soot from old diesel engines, coal power plants, industrial smog, the stuff that causes asthma, cardiovascular disease, and premature death.
So let's apply that back to the timeline. In 2001 and 2002, the ANS was negative. What does that mean in practical terms for the people living there at that time?
It meant that the environmental damage and the resource depletion were entirely wiping out the financial gains.
So the growth was an illusion.
Yes. The traditional economy was growing, factories were producing, money was changing hands. But the hidden costs, the stripped resources, the workers missing days due to respiratory illness, the shortened lifespans from polluted air were literally costing the nation more than it was earning.
That is wild.
They were running a structural deficit against nature and their own lungs. They were, in your words, burning the furniture to keep the house warm.
But then we see this massive turnaround. Recently, the ANS has stabilized at above 14% of GNI.
Right, a huge shift.
I want you, the listener, to really internalize what this means because you can apply this directly to your own life. Imagine your personal savings account looks incredible. The number goes up every single month. That is traditional GDP.
A great feeling on paper.
Right. But now imagine you have a leaking roof that is rotting the wooden framing of your house, and the engine in your car is knocking, and you're totally ignoring both of those massive deferred maintenance costs.
Your bank account is an illusion at that point.
Exactly. Adjusted net savings is your true net worth once you deduct the cost of the rotting roof and the dying car. For North Macedonia, to pull that number out of the negative and push it up to 14% is like finally fixing the roof, repairing the car, and still managing to put 14% of your income into a retirement account.
It is a massive structural triumph. It really is.
It proves the growth is real.
It's the defining proof that the shift to a service economy we discussed earlier is actually working.
Because services don't pollute as much.
Exactly. A service economy driven by IT, finance, and telecommunications doesn't require clear-cutting forests or digging open-pit coal mines to generate its core value. A positive ANS above 14% shows a fundamental transition towards sustainable wealth creation. The wealth being generated by the new economy is finally outpacing the environmental degradation.
All right, so the economic engine is maturing. The wealth is becoming real, sustainable wealth. But an economy isn't an abstract mathematical construct. It is entirely made of people. So who exactly is doing all this high-productivity service work? This is where our analysis pivots away from the financial ledgers and directly into the human beings powering them. And the World Bank dataset reveals a demographic shift that is nothing short of seismic.
If we move to page 5 of the report, the data illustrates what demographers call a scissor effect in the country's dependency ratios.
It's an incredibly vivid term, too, because when you look at the graph, you literally see two lines sharply crossing each other, looking exactly like an open pair of scissors.
It's quite striking to look at.
Let's look at the specific numbers. First, we have the youth dependency ratio. This measures the number of young people, usually under 15, compared to the active working age population.
Right.
That number plunged from a historical high of 65.1% down to roughly 34.1%. It essentially halved.
A massive drop in youth.
Yeah. And on the other side, crossing the blades, we have the old age dependency ratio. That's the number of people over 65 compared to the working age population. That line skyrocketed from just 8.5% back in the 1960s to a staggering 27.6% by 2023.
It's a total inversion.
Today, citizens over the age of 65 make up 16.7% of the total population.
To fully grasp the societal implications of this scissor effect, we need to understand the profound, honestly crushing pressure that rapid aging puts on a nation's operational machinery.
Break that down for us.
When a country has a high youth dependency ratio, like North Macedonia did decades ago, the primary challenge is infrastructural. You have to build enough elementary schools, train enough teachers, and eventually create enough entry-level jobs.
Which is hard, but it's a good problem to have.
Exactly. It is a heavy burden, but it is fundamentally a burden of potential. Those youths represent a massive future workforce that will eventually pay taxes, consume goods, and drive innovation.
They are an investment that pays out over 40 years.
Precisely. But an old age dependency ratio climbing to 27.6% changes the fundamental arithmetic of the state entirely. It's a burden of maintenance, not potential.
Oof. That's a stark way to put it.
It's just what the numbers dictate. You have a shrinking cohort of young people entering the workforce to replace their retiring workers, which means the tax base actively shrinks.
Less money coming in.
Right. And simultaneously, you have a rapidly expanding cohort of retirees who are drawing on state pensions, utilizing social services, and requiring exponentially more expensive, complex, long-term health care.
There's more money going out.
Exactly. The economic weight on the shoulders of the shrinking working age population intensifies significantly. Every active worker is effectively taxed heavier and heavier to support the aging society above them.
That sounds unsustainable.
And I want to emphasize to you, the listener, this isn't just a localized issue for North Macedonia. What we are seeing in this data set is a perfect, accelerated preview of the global demographic winter that is currently bearing down on advanced economies across Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, and increasingly North America.
It is the ultimate demographic trap.
It really is.
But I want to push back on this narrative of doom and gloom for a second. Let's connect this to what we established in the first section.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the economy has successfully shifted from labor-intensive agriculture, which requires massive amounts of human muscle, to high-value, highly productive digital and service sectors, maybe they don't need a massive physical workforce anymore.
That's an interesting angle.
Right. I mean, if one software engineer writing code for a European tech firm can generate the GDP equivalent of 50 farm workers, can a smaller but significantly smarter and highly educated workforce comfortably carry the load of that aging population without the state collapsing?
That is the central hypothesis of modern economic development. If your labor force is shrinking due to demographic collapse, your only viable escape route is to make the remaining labor force hyperproductive.
So quality over quantity.
Exactly. You have to trade quantity for extreme quality. But to evaluate whether North Macedonia is actually pulling off that escape route, we have to measure their human capital. Are they actually producing that smarter, hyper-productive workforce?
Which brings us to the human capital analysis, specifically looking at education and gender dynamics. And the numbers here are genuinely stunning.
They are incredibly positive on the surface.
Yeah, looking at the data on female education and legal empowerment, we see historic, almost revolutionary strides. By 2020, 20.67% of all women over the age of 25 held a bachelor's degree.
A huge milestone.
And the acceleration in advanced degrees is even steeper. Master's degrees among women skyrocketed from a historical baseline of just 0.2% to roughly 2.1%.
Tenfold increase.
Alongside this, there's been a surge in legal standing. The World Bank uses the Women, Business, and the Law Index, which measures how laws affect women's economic opportunities. That score leaped by 23.1 points, going from 61.75 in the 1970s to 85.0 in the 2020s.
A score of 85 on that index means that the vast majority of institutional and legal hurdles regarding freedom of movement, workplace protections, equal remuneration, and property rights have been successfully dismantled.
So the legal roadblocks are basically gone.
For the most part, yes. And when you combine that legal empowerment with a massive surge in women obtaining advanced degrees, you are witnessing the unlocking of the economic potential of half the population.
Which is exactly what you need for that hyper-productive workforce.
Exactly. In an agricultural economy, physical strength often dictates labor value, which naturally disenfranchises women. But in a service economy, cognitive ability is the primary currency. This transition allows female educational dominance to directly translate into economic power. Theoretically, this is the exact smarter workforce you were hoping for to offset the aging population.
I hear the theoretically in your voice.
Well, you know me.
Because the data isn't all upward trends and dismantled hurdles, is it? The report exposes some massive structural pitfalls in how this human capital is developed and deployed.
It does. The data reveals deep contradictions that actually threaten the entire model. The first major pitfall is found at the very beginning of the human capital pipeline.
Where are we looking?
The report highlights a stubborn, pervasive issue known as learning poverty.
Learning poverty.
Yes, this is a specific metric tracking the percentage of children who cannot read and understand a simple, age-appropriate text by the time they are 10 years old.
Oh, wow. At 10.
Yeah. The World Bank data shows that primary school reading levels in North Macedonia are struggling to meet the minimum GML thresholds. That's the Global Alliance to Monitor Learning.
Wait, let's pause there. If a 10-year-old cannot read and comprehend a basic story, they are entirely locked out of the cognitive, service-driven economy we just spent 20 minutes praising.
Completely locked out.
If you can't read at age 10, you aren't writing code or analyzing financial data at age 25. Why is this foundational education struggling so much while university degrees are booming?
It usually points to deep inequalities in the education system itself. It often reflects a stark urban-rural divide.
So the cities are doing well, but the countryside is falling behind.
Exactly. Schools in the capital city are often well-funded and produce university-bound students. But rural primary schools suffer from underpaid teachers, a lack of modern pedagogical materials, and outdated rote memorization teaching methods.
That's a huge structural flaw.
It is. But the contradictions don't stop at the bottom of the ladder. If we look back at those highly educated women, the ones who successfully navigated the system and earned those master's degrees, the data explicitly shows that they remain significantly underrepresented in middle and senior management positions across the corporate landscape.
So synthesizing this, it's like the country built a phenomenal state-of-the-art university at the very top of a skyscraper. It's churning out brilliant, highly credentialed women. But the public elementary school on the ground floor of that exact same building is chronically underfunded, struggling to teach basic literacy.
A perfect analogy.
And to make the whole structure even more maddening, the elevator going from the ground floor up to the executive corporate suites gets stuck halfway up, trapping the best female talent under a persistent glass ceiling.
That analogy perfectly captures the systemic friction here. If your macroeconomic survival depends on creating a hyper-productive workforce to carry the financial burden of an aging society, you simply cannot afford a leaky pipeline at the foundational primary level.
You need every single mind.
Exactly. And you certainly cannot afford to bench your most highly educated talent because of patriarchal corporate cultures or a lack of childcare infrastructure that enforces a glass ceiling.
And this friction at the educational and corporate level bleeds directly into the broader realities of the labor market. Because ultimately, all of these people, the ones who struggle with reading at age 10 and the ones who got their master's degrees at 25, they all have to go out and find a job.
Yes, they enter the labor pool.
And this pulls us into what the data calls the labor paradox. When you look at the labor market indicators, youth unemployment, specifically people aged 15 to 24, is historically stubbornly high.
It's a massive issue.
It represents a massive vulnerability. Yes, the data shows some downward trends in recent years, but it remains the primary economic bottleneck. Alongside that, the overall male labor force participation rate for those 15 and older has remained stagnant, hovering right around 60%.
This is the exact paradox of the economic transformation. We have established that the service economy is booming, generating billions in wealth, and driving the adjusted net savings into positive territory.
The wealth is there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yet the same booming economy fundamentally fails to efficiently absorb its own youth.
But why? If the service sector is growing so fast, shouldn't it be desperate for young, entry-level workers?
It is desperate for workers, but it requires specific workers. The paradox is driven by a severe skills mismatch.
How does that happen?
Well, when a country rapidly shifts away from traditional agriculture and state-run heavy industry, the jobs that used to absorb young workers with only basic or struggling education simply disappear.
Right, the factory floor jobs are gone.
Exactly. The new jobs in IT, finance, logistics, and specialized services require critical thinking, digital literacy, and soft skills. And those are often the exact skills that are hindered by early learning poverty.
So they just don't qualify for the new jobs.
So you end up with a tragic irony. A high youth unemployment rate existing simultaneously with a modern service sector that is struggling to find qualified local talent.
That explains the youth. But what about the older men? A male labor force participation rate of 60% means that 4 out of every 10 working-age men have simply opted out of the formal economy. Where are they?
When you see a stagnant participation rate of 60% in a developing economy, it usually indicates a thriving informal or gray economy.
Off the books.
Exactly. Many of those men may be working in unregulated construction, seasonal agriculture, or cash-in-hand services that avoid taxation and formal reporting.
Which starves the state of tax revenue.
Yes. And additionally, in economies like North Macedonia, there is often a heavy reliance on remittances.
Money sent back from family living abroad.
Right. Money sent from family members who have emigrated to Western Europe or North America. If a household receives strong, steady euros or dollars from abroad, the urgency to accept a low-paying, formal entry-level job diminishes, which further depresses the official labor participation rate.
I want to explore the darker implications of this, specifically regarding the unemployed youth. Let's connect this back to the demographic scissor effect we talked about.
Okay, let's connect the dots.
If you are a 22-year-old and you can't find a foothold in this new service economy because of a skills mismatch, you don't just sit around forever, you leave.
You look elsewhere.
Doesn't this massive youth unemployment essentially guarantee youth emigration? And if the youth leave, doesn't that immediately accelerate the exact aging crisis we talked about earlier?
It does. It is the most dangerous, self-reinforcing feedback loop a developing economy can face. It is called the brain drain.
The brain drain.
Yeah. If your most frustrated, dynamic young people emigrate to Germany or Switzerland seeking opportunity, they take their human capital with them, they take their future tax revenue with them.
And they take the next generation with them.
Exactly. They take the children they haven't had yet with them. This immediately worsens the old age dependency ratio back home and hollows out the exact generation the country needs to sustain its digital transformation. It is a slow-motion crisis that basically eats the future of the nation.
It's a heavy, incredibly daunting challenge. The system seems so fragile when you look at it that way.
It does have vulnerabilities.
But as we continue to comb through this massive World Bank data set, the narrative isn't entirely defined by these structural struggles. In fact, right next to the labor paradox, the data reveals an absolute undeniable triumph in a completely different sector. A triumph in what is arguably the most fundamental moral duty of any state, keeping its citizens alive.
The public health data in this report is nothing short of miraculous.
Really?
If we look at the health outcomes over the past 3 decades, we see a historic leap forward. Let's look at the raw absolute numbers. In the early 1990s, during that period of chaotic transition, the infant mortality rate was roughly 2,000 deaths a year.
2,000.
Yes. By 2022, that number had crashed to less than 100.
Wow.
That is an exponential, precipitous drop. Similarly, the overall life expectancy for the nation rose steadily from just 60.6 years back in 1960 to 76.6 years by 2019.
It's almost 2 decades of extra life.
Right. Now, the data does show a noticeable dip post-2020, but that aligns perfectly with the external shock of the global pandemic. The multi-decade trend, however, is overwhelmingly, undeniably positive.
Taking infant deaths from 2,000 a year down to under 100 in just 3 decades, that is profound. We are talking about 1,900 families a year who do not have to endure the unimaginable tragedy of burying a newborn child.
It's a staggering achievement.
It really is. It's easy to get lost in the percentages in the G&I graphs, but that metric right there is the definition of human progress. But how exactly did they achieve it? What is the mechanism behind that drop?
It correlates directly and powerfully with state investment and capacity. The data shows that government health expenditure routinely tops 65% of total health spending.
So the state stepped up.
The state stepped up massively. When a government dedicates consistent, high-level funding to establishing robust maternal care networks, outfitting neonatal intensive care units with modern incubators, expanding rural vaccination programs, and ensuring clean sanitation in hospitals, the results are immediate and dramatic.
You can see it right there in the numbers.
Exactly. Dropping the infant mortality rate that drastically isn't an accident, it is the hallmark of a society that decided to heavily fund the protection of its most vulnerable.
Okay, so the state clearly has the capacity to execute highly complex, life-saving initiatives nationwide. But here is where the data presents us with another paradox.
There's always another layer.
Always. The researchers also incorporated the WGI, the Worldwide Governance Indicators, into their analysis. And when we look at the operational machinery of the state outside of the hospital ward, the picture gets very murky.
The WGI metrics are fascinating because they break governance down into specific dimensions.
What are we seeing?
Well, on one hand, the data shows that North Macedonia is quite competitive regionally in areas like regulatory quality.
Meaning what?
This means the state is relatively efficient when it comes to the rules on the books. It's fairly straightforward to register a new IT business, navigate basic commercial regulations, and operate within the legal framework.
Okay, that's good for the service economy.
Very good. They also show solid, stable metrics in voice and accountability, meaning citizens have a level of political participation and freedom of expression. However, the indicator measuring the control of corruption faces ongoing downward pressure and significant troubling fluctuations.
I am struggling to reconcile this.
It's a common contradiction.
But how can a state apparatus be incredibly effective at building specialized neonatal hospitals, funding complex maternal care networks, and saving thousands of infants, but simultaneously struggle with controlling corruption? How do those two realities coexist in the exact same government?
It seems contradictory, but it is actually a very common phenomenon in political science known as asymmetric state capacity.
Asymmetric state capacity.
Yes, state capacity is rarely uniform. The machinery of a modern government is vast and highly segmented. You can have a Ministry of Health staffed by dedicated technocrats and medical professionals who brilliantly execute a nationwide vaccination and maternal care strategy. They have a clear mission and measurable biological outcomes.
Right, keep the babies alive.
Exactly. But simultaneously, the public procurement offices, the departments responsible for transparently handing out the lucrative state contracts to build those hospitals or pave the roads leading to them, might be captured by patronage networks, nepotism, or political favoritism.
I see.
I would encourage you, as a listener, to think about your own local or national government. It's entirely normal for a state to succeed brilliantly in one sector, like public health or rapid infrastructure deployment, while lagging significantly in anti-corruption enforcement or judicial transparency.
The skill sets are completely different.
Right. The skills required to save a premature infant are entirely different from the institutional safeguards required to prevent a politician from giving a construction contract to their cousin.
That makes perfect, if somewhat cynical sense. It's all about where the institutional guardrails are strong and where they are weak. Which brings us to the final leg of our journey through this data set.
It's a big picture.
Exactly. We have looked at the economic engine, the aging demographics, the paradox of education and labor, and the triumphs and flaws of the state. To wrap up this analysis, we turn to the physical reality of the country today, its technology and its physical environment, which leads us directly into the academic report's synthesized blueprint for the future.
If we look at the physical manifestation of that shift to a service economy, the data reveals exponential growth in digital infrastructure.
The actual hardware.
Right. There's been a massive surge in the number of secure internet servers per million people. This is the literal physical backbone of a digital economy. You cannot run a modern IT sector or export digital services without secure server capacity.
You need the pipes.
You need the pipes. Furthermore, the rate of patent applications filed by residents is healthy, which reflects an active, localized culture of technical innovation.
But, and there is always a but, when transitioning an entire nation tethered to this digital leap forward is a massive, heavy, industrial era anchor.
The environmental footprint.
Exactly. The data reveals that a staggering 77 to over 80% of total energy consumption in North Macedonia still relies heavily on fossil fuels.
That's a huge dependency.
Yes, the data notes a micro increase of about 10,000 hectares in forest area. But the macro reality is that the energy grid powering those modern, secure internet servers is deeply, deeply carbon intensive.
It is the ultimate paradox of the modernizing state. You have highly educated software engineers writing code for the global market, stored on secure cloud servers. But the electricity keeping those servers cool is generated by burning lignite coal in aging power plants.
It's the old world powering the new world.
Exactly. And this paradox leads us to the grand finale of the academic report. After analyzing thousands of rows of data across all these sectors, the researchers didn't just leave us with a list of problems.
They gave us a roadmap.
They proposed a highly synthesized three-point strategic blueprint for the future. Strategy number 1. Delay retirement and aggressively utilize automation. Strategy number 2. Execute a massive green energy transition. And strategy number 3. Fine-tune governance and anti-corruption measures to attract foreign direct investment, or FDI.
Let's tie these strategies back to everything we've discussed today, because they elegantly address the exact vulnerabilities we've uncovered. Let's look at strategy 1, delaying retirement and utilizing automation. This is the direct mathematical answer to the demographic scissor effect.
Absolutely.
If the youth dependency ratio has plummeted and the young people are emigrating because of the labor paradox, you simply don't have enough physical humans to do the work. The only solution is to keep the healthy, older population in the workforce longer and use AI, software, and industrial automation to replace the missing young labor.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's the only viable path. And strategy 2, the green energy transition, is the direct cure for that heavy fossil fuel reliance. But more importantly, it is how you permanently secure that adjusted net savings metric we talked about in section 2.
Right, the real wealth indicator.
By transitioning to solar, wind, and hydro, you stop the massive PM 2.5 particulate pollution, you stop poisoning the workforce, you stop writing hidden checks against your future health and wealth, ensuring that the GDP growth is genuinely sustainable.
That fixes the roof and the car engine.
Exactly. And finally, strategy 3, fine-tuning governance and anti-corruption. This is the necessary step to solve the labor paradox and the youth unemployment crisis.
Wait, let me stop you there. How does stopping corruption create jobs for a 22-year-old?
Because capital is cowardly.
Capital is cowardly. I like that.
Global tech companies, massive logistics firms, and international manufacturers want to invest in emerging markets. They want to bring foreign direct investment, but they require legal certainty.
They need to know the rules won't change.
They will not build a massive regional headquarters in a country if they fear they will be shaken down for bribes or if the courts cannot fairly enforce a contract. By controlling corruption and improving the rule of law, the state creates a safe harbor for global capital.
And then the jobs follow.
Exactly. Those foreign companies then move in, bringing the modern, high-paying service jobs that can finally absorb the unemployed youth, potentially halting the brain drain and stabilizing the demographic collapse.
It really is a masterful synthesis. It takes a chaotic, volatile, 30-year narrative of a country fighting to find its way in the world and brings it to a cohesive, actionable climax. So let's quickly recap this incredible journey for the listener.
Let's do it.
We started in the volatile 1990s, watching North Macedonia successfully and painfully transform its entire economic structure from traditional agriculture to a high-value service economy. We saw them pull their adjusted net savings out of the red, proving their wealth was real.
A huge milestone.
We saw them educate their women to historic heights, and we saw an absolute public health miracle that saved thousands of infants. But we also saw that by succeeding, by modernizing, they unlocked the boss-level challenges of the 21st century.
The structural vulnerability.
Right. A rapidly aging population, a stubborn youth unemployment crisis, driven by a skills mismatch, a persistent glass ceiling, and a heavy addiction to fossil fuels.
It is a profound narrative of human progress, accompanied by all the complex friction that progress creates. And I want to remind you, the listener, why this deep dive matters to you, regardless of whether you live in Skopje, London, Tokyo, or New York.
It's a universal story.
It is. North Macedonia serves as a perfect, accelerated microcosm of the global economy. Whether you live in a rapidly developing nation in the global south or a massive G7 superpower, these exact metrics are defining your reality.
The same rules apply.
The dependency ratios, crossing like a scissor, the hidden environmental costs of traditional GDP, the stubborn learning poverty holding back a digital transition, the asymmetric capacity of your local government. These are the exact same dials and levers controlling your future. The data we explored today is entirely universal.
Absolutely. The mechanics are the same everywhere, only the scale changes. Now, before we sign off, I know you were looking at the long-term implications of this data, specifically regarding the digital infrastructure and the youth emigration. What is the final thought you want to leave the listener with today?
It's a thought that isn't explicitly spelled out in the data set, but it is the logical conclusion of every trend we've discussed today. We've seen that a country can completely digitize its economy, shift to services, and dramatically extend human life in just a few decades.
The physical transformation.
Right. But as populations age, as the youth increasingly work online, and as borders become effortlessly fluid for remote digital work, will the concept of a strictly national economy even matter in another 30 years?
Oh, wow.
Think about the implications. If your highly educated youth are physically living in your country, using your roads and your subsidized electricity, but they are working entirely online for foreign tech companies, and your digital wealth is hosted on secure servers in an international cloud, what exactly defines the borders of your country's wealth?
The borders just dissolve.
If your workforce is globally distributed and borderless, but your aging retirees are localized and dependent on a state pension, how does a nation-state balance its books in the future? We started today by imagining a time-lapse camera looking down on the physical factories and fields of 1990, turning into the server farms and wind turbines of 2023. I want you to mull over what that time-lapse will look like by 2050, when the actual infrastructure of a nation's wealth might be entirely invisible.
That is a staggering thought to end on, the invisible economy. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will catch you next time.